Sam, welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for coming. Been looking forward to it. Mindset podcast. This is the start of our second season, if you like. We started this. We've done 6, 7 episodes. Embracing adversity, leading to positive change or leading to change. So we try and explore all angles around people's wisdom from the challenges they've experienced in their life or otherwise. But yeah, maybe we could start with you just introducing yourself and letting us know a bit about you.
Yeah, of course. My name's Sam McAlister. My background is that I started as a criminal defence barrister too long ago to mention. Let's not go there. And then after that, I worked at the BBC for a number of years. Latterly, at BBC Newsnight, where probably I'm best known for negotiating that interview with Prince Andrew, which you might have heard about.
Yes,
if
indeed.
you haven't seen it,
Indeed.
Spoiler alert, it didn't go well.
Yeah.
Since then, I left the BBC, wrote a book, had a documentary on Channel 4, and then latterly, this sounds like I'm completely mad, but it is true, my book got optioned by Netflix, and I've just been played by Billy Piper in a Netflix movie about my life called Scoop.
Yes, indeed, yes, and I got after we spoke, because we spoke briefly, I got a copy of the book, and I was reading the opening chapters and a bit around your upbringing, and there was lots of change, it seemed, in terms of moving around and your parents being hard workers and looking at working 7 days a week. And I wonder if there's, just going back to that time for you, how much you think that period has played into where you are today. Because I think objectively, if you look at your life today, and obviously we don't know each other, but anyone would say, okay, this is a woman with success in terms of your career, your accomplishments, and where you are. How much do you think that's fed in? Because when I was reading it, it seemed like there was a bit of a parallel there. It seemed like, oh, that's quite a challenging thing to be moving around, seemed somewhat frequently, but equally there was also a kind of beauty to it because you were able to live an island life and go running and cycling and climbing and all this kind of stuff. So how much of that do you think's played into to who you are now?
Well, just to be very clear, I never went running. I think
Okay,
that's the most important takeaway.
Okay.
Fast walk, maybe. I think it's an interesting observation. I mean, in truth, my parents didn't work 7 days a week when they had me.
Right.
Prior to my birth, they had worked 8 days a week. I know that's not a thing, but they worked their nads off. And my mum came from working class family, council estate, market people here in London, Leadenhall, very close to where we are, East End. And my dad came from a smaller household where both his parents had died by the time he was 18.
Right.
And he left school at 14 as well. So they'd both worked up from nothing. They had, by the time I moved to Guernsey, which was the first place that I spent my childhood, made a bit of cash, and they left during that period where taxation was a little bit spicy.
Right.
And my dad basically became a tax exile, to be frank. So at the stage at which I arrive on the scene and cognizant of my parents, I was in a very exceptional situation, an only child with two parents who had effectively retired young, who were with me 24/7 in a household brimming with unconditional love and energy and, excitement and fun, but with no formal education.
Right.
So a very unusual and lucky state to be in with all that attention and unconditional love, for sure.
It's only child.
Only child.
And you talked a bit about, I think you used the word relentless around in those opening chapters, and how you've adapted that into your life, or you were adapting it into your life. And it seemed to be that may have come from the work ethic of your parents. I don't know. How has that played out for you in terms of, because when I read that word, it brings connotations of, okay, well, is there scope for overreaching or underachieving? Because relentlessness brings a sense of, I've always got to be hitting something. How has that played out for you in terms of, is that something you still live by, or is that something that you found when you look back from that moment into university, into the rest of your career, that it's something that you perhaps would do differently?
No, I think I use it as the opening word in my book, actually, relentless. And for some, it's a moniker of abuse, and for some, it's a moniker of flattery. But the truth is that I learned at a very early age that the buck stops with me in a really good way. My mum and dad did have a little bit of cash by then, but there was no plan B. it was very clear message that I would be loved to the ends of the earth, which I always have been, but I needed to make my own way.
Yeah.
And in a sense, that relentlessness, which I consider a fantastic trait, is just that kind of like unending self-belief, a confidence, and just keeping trying hard. That doesn't mean it always goes right for me.
No.
But I never really give up, and I have perhaps an optimism about things working out for myself if I put in heart and graft.
Yeah.
And really that message was given to me, that you need to be a grafter, not a grifter. And certainly in my professional life, I've met a lot of grifters and not so many grafters. So I feel proud to have, if you like, that relentless ethic of pay your bills, do right by your family, try and do well for yourself. But, you know, not at any cost, find a balance between happiness and healthiness and ambition.
Yeah.
And I feel really fortunate that I have.
Yeah. Yeah. And do you think that self-belief, as you talk about there, because that's not an easy thing for people to find, of course. You know,
it isn't.
Did you have a journey with that, or do you think that was just because of the unconditional love you received that you've always easily managed to find it?
I didn't realise it was so unusual, that kind of background, you know,
Right.
just parents that really believe in you. I've never been criticised by my parents. I don't remember them ever saying anything mean to me. And I remember when I used to go to friends' houses and their parents would say stuff, you know, pejorative stuff about their appearance or their intellect. I mean, to be fair, I was top of the class, but, you know, nonetheless, my parents never said anything mean or cruel. They just were cheerleading me. And I do think that is a massive, massive part of it. And separately, I think that one of the things my mum taught me very early on, because my dad was manic depressive back when it wasn't, you know, a thing, was that I had to learn to separate myself from the opinions and behavior of people around me, and to find my own kind of like way to deal with, you know, the ups and downs that sometimes that could bring. And that, I think, was the other essential gift, that I'm beautifully oblivious to other people's opinions of me. And that has given me a satisfaction and happiness that seems incredibly rare, particularly nowadays.
Yeah, well, yeah, certainly, yeah. The modern world's a very different world for that, that's 100%. For sure. And so it's almost a compartmentalising you learn. And are you saying that's partly because of what was going on with your dad, the swinging from depression to being okay? And
yeah, a little bit. I mean, it didn't really affect me in that way, because when he was doing well, he was just one of the most fascinating, charismatic men you would ever meet. And my mum is so clever and charismatic and brilliant as well, and witty and fun. So I think really what I learned, and I articulate it this way now with the benefit of age, that I have what I would call two experiences in life. I have the objective experience where, for example, I can see that people are behaving badly, or they're thinking something negative of me, or they're trying to undermine me, and I can see that is happening objectively. But subjectively, it doesn't reach me in the same way. It's kind of like two boxes. An outside box where the objective knows that's happening, and then the subjective experience where, although it might pee me off or make me angry for 5 minutes or even make me cry, who knows, the internal core just isn't bothered. And I hadn't realised how exceptionally fortunate I am to have that. And it's got me through all kinds of difficult professional and personal situations. So the subjective self is very, very self-controlled most of the time.
Yes, because you're human, of course.
Of course.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm not AI, not yet.
No, I wanted to talk about university a little bit, because I was intrigued by your self-awareness. You talked about you went and found a different group of friends, not maybe the stereotypical group of friends that you would have, and outside, I think it was friends outside of university.
That's right.
Yeah, and I was intrigued by that. Was obviously a conscious decision, and one that seemed to play out well for you because you felt comfortable and it seemed like you enjoyed your time. How do you think you were able to spot that? And the reason I'm asking this question is because that in itself, again, is a sort of that self-awareness, and learning these things are quite crucial skills, and skills that probably played out a lot in your journey so far in life, in your ability to pivot and change, because your journey has been one of change. So I wonder, at that point at university, how is that something that just again came naturally to you? Did you have a moment where you went, do you know what? You know, how did you figure that out? Yeah,
I'm beginning to sound like a self-help book, for which I apologise. But I think basically, you know, I always concentrated on the understanding there are some things you can change and there's some things you can't. So when I arrived at university, and it was really my first experience of class, because I hadn't been aware of it as an issue. And look, I'm firmly middle class now, but, you know, obviously my background was working class, council estate, parents who were super clever, but didn't have the opportunity to have education. And that put me really, you know, kind of like ill prepared for some of the behavior of some of the other students at university who clearly, you know, were just there for ski trips and to take the pee, really, and didn't value education. And I wasn't a natural fit for lots of them, and they weren't a natural fit for me. So can I change hundreds of years of, you know, class and human behavior and, you know, kind of that? Answer, no. But can I mix with people who I feel more comfortable with and happier with and have lots of fun and not find university alienating? Yes, I can. So what I did was manage to tread the two worlds. So, you know, obviously I enjoyed my university experience, wasn't perhaps as intellectually edifying as I had hoped because of the company.
Yeah.
But I also really enjoyed the social experience, but largely not with people that I was at university with.
Yeah, yeah, which is more than fair enough. So you then went on to do, is it the BVC, the Bar Vocational Course, or what?
There's a bit in between that is really cool, actually. And the one time I loved education, it's called the Conversion Course.
Yeah, that's
and
right.
It's when you do 3 years in 9 months. Are you insane? Yes, I was.
Yeah.
Brutal and absolutely intellectually thrilling.
Yes, yeah, I did the GDL, which is the conversion for the solicitor side.
Exactly.
Which, yeah. And then you then went and applied for jobs, and interestingly, we're just talking about class. I mean, when I was going through that process, I remember being struck by how many people I spoke to who had alluded to, and I'm not saying this is still the case now, although I'm pretty sure it probably is, that really, unless you were from a certain background, went to a certain school and knew people, getting into a pupillage was particularly difficult. So how was it? I know that you talked about the fact you loved debating and that you felt like you had a skill there, but what was it that drove you towards that aim off the back of that experience at university and feeling like, actually, these aren't my tribe, I'm going to find a different tribe, and then moving forward into that industry as a barrister?
Yeah, I mean, I was just beautifully oblivious to all of this. I mean, you're absolutely right. If you were looking at the data, the likelihood that I would get a pupillage was probably 1,000,000 to 1, but I ended up being offered 3, right? So the beautiful obliviousness to all of that is hugely important, I think, because it's very easy to stumble by the wayside when perhaps a teacher says to you, oh, you can't do that. And then you go, oh, well, that's a fact. I did have a you can't do that moment at university with someone in my 4th year. You do 4 years there. It was very long. And
4 years as a pupillage?
No, you do when you're at university in Edinburgh, it's 4 years.
Yeah.
And in the last year, the reason I ended up doing the law was actually didn't really know what I wanted to do. I'd never met a lawyer. I'd only seen them on This Life or, you know, on telly.
Yeah.
So I didn't have that circle. And there was a lad there who I got on with, and I asked him what he was doing, and he said he was going to become a barrister. And I was like, oh, well, we can't do that because we didn't do law undergrad. And he explained there was this course. And I said, well, that sounds perfect. You know, I love to argue and I love clever stuff.
Yeah.
So it sounds like a good combo. And he said to me, oh, no, people like you don't get on that course. And he didn't actually mean it cruelly. It was actually a statement of empirical truth, probably.
Right.
But I did get on the course, and I didn't apply to spite him. It was just I was like blindingly optimistic all the way through. So I think, you know, although I didn't end up staying at the bar, the experience of trying and being there for a couple of years and deciding it wasn't for me was a great privilege.
Massive,
and I'm hugely grateful I had that opportunity to mix in that circle, particularly with the clients.
Yes.
Because doing criminal defence, it was much more my tribe.
Yes, yeah. Which interestingly, when I was reading the book, I could relate to that as well, because when I did my GDL, the only actual law I enjoyed was criminal law, and there weren't many jobs or money in it, so I didn't.
Correct.
But so you mentioned there about, he said, oh, people like you don't get in, or something to that effect, and there was also something in the book where you'd gone to an interview, and I think a lady called Philippa had left before the end of the interview.
Don't blame her. It was a terrible answer.
Well, but I'm wondering how these things, you know, was this youthful confidence? Did it emotionally impact you? How did these moments on that journey actually just brush it off your shoulder, or was it go home, feel a bit sorry for yourself, and then pick yourself back up? How did that play out?
I kind of have a 5-minute rule. I'll indulge feeling sorry for myself for 5 minutes, but you know, another phrase from my mum: "No babies are dead." And one of the things I teach now at London School of Economics, and one of the things I try to impart to my students is this, and it's a bit of a revelation for them. People are entitled to say no to you.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Now, it may be that they say no to you for reasons that you might think are prejudiced, and that is awful, and we're sorry about that, and we hope that changes.
Yeah.
But people are entitled to say no. And I think, in a sense, I didn't have that narcissism of thinking that I deserved everything that I went for. There might be 1,000 people applying or 10,000. Why do you think that you are the only person who should get it? I didn't have that gene. I hadn't been taught that as a child.
Right.
So, of course, you're disappointed. You might, take a moment to feel sorry for yourself. But I didn't believe I had a birthright to be a member of the Supreme Court or a head of chambers. I believed if I grafted and I had a bit of luck, maybe I could be if I wanted to. And I tried and tried and tried. But I didn't believe that it was definite. I believed it was possible.
Yeah. Okay. So actually, it was almost, you getting something was possible, but it was also perhaps a bonus is the wrong way of framing it. But
that's a great way to frame it. It was a massive bonus.
Yeah.
It was such a thrill. And that, in a sense, is the beautiful freedom of a background like mine.
Yeah.
Because my parents were not like, you need to go to this college. I still don't understand all the college stuff. Everyone I know went to Oxford and Cambridge, but I still got no clue when they're wanging on about the college stuff. Still don't get it, all these years later.
Yeah.
But for me, every opportunity was a blessing and a gift. It wasn't taken for granted. It wasn't expected. And it was hugely celebrated by my parents, just as it was if I was kind to someone. In fact, that was probably celebrated more.
Yeah, and actually you talked about that as well as terms of principles, and I think principles, it took me 31 years to realise or to be courageous enough to apply the principles I would like in my life to what I do in my job as well, to the best of my ability. And I think you talked a lot around, you were taught principles, or it seems you were taught principles, and acting with kindness and I'm probably misremembering, but humility and those kind of things jumped out at me when I was reading about it. Was that again all the upbringing? Is that something you still are trying to apply in all your relationships now?
Yeah, it is my guiding force.
Yeah.
It's not fake. As someone said to me the other day, you give this impression. It's not an impression. It really is like when you're thinking about your life and the things that you want. I'm not a religious person. I'm not, looking to run the country or run the world. But what I would like, for my personal legacy, not what people remember of me, but what I did for myself, is to, where possible, make people's lives a bit nicer, not nastier.
Yeah.
I don't always get it right. Sometimes I lose my temper, or I can be a pain, or people take a dislike. But largely, that is my prime motivation more than almost anything. Not for reward, but it's just the thing that I think matters.
Yeah.
And the thing that also makes me happy.
Yes.
And leaves a little bit of something better in the world rather than something bad.
Yeah, definitely. I can relate to the making you feel happy bit,
It's a nice feeling.
It is a nice feeling, yes, indeed. So what was then quite interesting to me was, and I really enjoyed your honesty around it, the journey of being a barrister. So you enjoyed working with the clients, but it seemed like, you say it was a living hell. You can't explain how hard you found it, and you had constant days in anxiety, feeling the burden of the task ahead of you, feeling out your depth, insomnia, hair loss, crippling. How did you, when you look back, because I suspect in the moment you were just simply dealing with it, and I know obviously you reached a point where you made a decision not to continue for those reasons, but when you look back, how did you manage that? Because that sounds pretty bad by anyone's standards.
Yeah, it wasn't ideal. Understatement. It was just, there's a stage at which you're just like, this is not how life is meant to be. And I remember sitting actually at Pret-a-Manger in Chancery Lane. Other food chains are available.
Yeah.
And I would go there, and the highlight of my day, and it could be like 6 a.m. or 7 a.m. or, whatever ghastly time it was. I'm not a morning person. The highlight of my day would to buy a mocha and a Pret croissant, which I couldn't really afford because we were on, pennies. And I just thought, this is not how my life should be. I'm 24 years old. I'm in London, city of dreams. I'd always wanted to live here. It was such a thrill. I had lovely friends who I never got to see. I didn't drink. I was completely teetotal, and the drinking culture was not really my vibe.
Interesting.
I never got to go anywhere. I never got to do anything fun. I might as well have been living on the moon. So it was just the relentless unhappiness of it. And there was a stage at which, I wasn't, it makes it sound like I was really depressed. I wasn't really depressed at all. I was just miserable as sin.
Yeah.
And every day I did not enjoy it. And there's a stage at which you're just like, I can't live like this. So I walked away.
And you said that night you had the best night's sleep you'd had in a long time.
Oh, it was so good.
Yeah. Which is amazing, right? Because that says you've made the right decision.
It was a really good decision. I don't feel I've ever made a bad decision. But again, it's not an arrogance thing.
Yeah.
I do weigh up factors, and then I make the decision and I take the consequences. Now, the consequence was I had no job and no income.
Yeah.
But the decision was a great one because I had no job and no income, which was resolvable, rational, with, a good education and my background and qualifications I had and my tenacity. So I knew that was solvable.
Right.
But the decision was fantastic because I just, my hair stopped dropping out and I wasn't, having to consume so much mocha and croissant as well, which was also great.
Yeah. It's interesting because, again, the decision is backed, because the reason I wouldn't, for example, it was me, if I go, what do I weigh up? Well, it's the fear, isn't it? It's the fear of the unknown and the fear of what happens if I don't have the income and everything else. And what offsets that fear seemingly is the self-belief and understanding that you're able to solve it, as you've just said. So that's what really stands out from what you're saying to me. And then it seemed like you then utilised your network to have a trial of an intern, whatever it was. Was it radio initially?
Yeah, I basically asked 3 pals to go and spend some time doing work experience. Horribly anti-meritocratic, for which I apologise. But I'd learnt by then that anti-meritocratic was the way to get things done, sadly.
Yeah.
And I had a tiny network by then of friends who'd been to university with me.
Yeah.
So 3 pals, all women, who were doing interesting jobs. And one was working at Radio 4, a woman called Kate Wright, who's really a great person and very kindly let me go for a day. And a day became 6 weeks, and 6 weeks became 16 years.
Wow. Yeah. And you started working as a producer in radio?
Yeah, it was a program called Law in Action on Radio 4. And no one they were very clever people, but no one on the team had a legal qualification. So when you've studied law, as you all know yourself, everyone thinks you know the law.
Yes.
Like all of it. Parking tickets, rape, commercial disputes.
Yeah.
So I did have more of a grounding than others, although their intellects were searing. And so it was just very helpful because it was a magazine program that went out once a week with 3 or 4 items. And I would probably come up with 3 of the ideas for the program that week. And, pop off to the Supreme Court, get a judgment. And it was Radio 4, so you could do kind of a summary of a House of Lords judgment. It was just wonderfully indulgent for that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So I really enjoyed it. And then I moved to a program called More or Less, which is about data and numbers, which was my great passion as a young woman. Maths was my great joy. So I moved into that with a brilliant guy called Andrew Dilnott, who is a very famous economist. And he was just so what I had expected at university. He was, and he is, he's still with us, fearsomely intellectual, but never patronizing. And he would always explain things to me on a piece of paper without ever making me feel like an idiot. He would impart knowledge with graciousness and deftly and brilliantly. And I just thought that was my most enjoyable kind of professional experience until I worked with Jeremy Paxman, that he was so gracious with his capability rather than trying to make people feel small. He would try and raise them up.
Yes, which again stood out to me when I read that, because it leadership and human behaviour fascinates me, and it's interesting to me how often, not often, I'd argue all the time, in fact, the best leaders are ones that are usually the most secure and are able to give, for want of a better phrase, love or graciousness back to people, as opposed to constantly asserting themselves. And there's another skill to that, because that takes discipline, because again, you're human, and if you're in a position of leadership, you'll find yourself having an off day, but choosing that way of doing it is always more inspiring, I think.
Yeah, and even if it's not your nature, even if it's just a pragmatic decision, it just makes factual sense that your team will be more motivated if you're, nice or pretend to be nice to them. They'll be better at their job if you give them information to improve. And on the bottom line, they're more likely to stay.
Yes.
If they feel loyal to you, even if it's just, Machiavellian, it's still better to provide an environment like that where people are happy, they'll stay, and they learn and they do better. It just makes business sense as well as human sense.
I couldn't agree more. And then, so you shortly after that, had your Lucas.
I did. I had my little one. Well, he's not so little anymore.
Not so little
Taller
anymore.
than both of us.
Oh, really? Not a basketball player.
No, afraid not.
So you then had Lucas. And then when you came back, the job that you were doing before you had Lucas wasn't available anymore.
It should have been available, but it was made clear that it wasn't available to me as a part-time worker. So
so we were in that time where that was more of a thing.
Yes,
and
unfortunately.
Yeah, and so there's lots of change and reinventing perhaps, and then there's that situation. How do you go about, or how did you go about doing that consistently? Was there ever a time where you're going, do you know what, I'm exhausted with this, or frankly,
I've probably been exhausted for about 17 years, but
right? Yeah,
I think most parents have.
Yes,
we've got kids. I mean, the truth is there was no other option. I think peril and lack of options is a massive friend, actually. I mean, I was bringing up a child on my own. I'd left my husband, so I was getting divorced. Bring up a child on my own on a single income, which I appreciate in the national kind of like average, was fine, but not significant in comparison to the kinds of salaries we see here in the city.
Yeah.
So, there were no holidays, there was no car, worried about paying the bills. But there was peril. So I needed to find something that was interesting. My number one priority was my son. I've always spent more time with my child than in a workplace. That was a decision I wanted to make for myself and the way that I wanted to parent. And so I ended up on a day's work experience at Newsnight. I'll be honest with you, because I wanted to meet Jeremy Paxman.
Yeah.
And also because their shift system, weirdly, was hugely brilliant for a part-time worker.
Right.
Because full-time producers, they call it on the desk, you work on the news desk, would do these huge long days from like 9 a.m. till basically 1 a.m. by the time everything was done. And if you were part-time, you did 2.
Right.
So I could do 2 stressful as hell, incredibly interesting, terrifying days. And then I'd have 5 days off. Okay, I was exhausted. But 5 days with my son and on 66.6 of the salary. Wow. So it was just really an incredibly lucky time that I went there for a day and then begged to stay for 6 weeks again, which is one of my things.
Yeah.
And I was there for, I think, 12 or 13 years. It was just a gift from God, really.
Yeah.
To have that opportunity to work there, pay my bills, bring up my son, and have something so stimulating and fascinating and terrifying to do.
Yes, yeah. And did that also bring a welcome distraction with the divorce stuff, or was the divorce stuff relatively okay? Was that...
Yeah, I'm very pragmatic with these things.
Yeah.
So as you can probably tell, I mean, no disrespect to my ex-husband, he's fantastic, but if I've made a decision, I'm, my heart's gone.
We're off, yeah.
We're off.
Yeah.
So that wasn't really, in practical terms, it had an effect. But, he has a great relationship with his son. It was important to me that they maintained that relationship. He's a fantastic father. But for me, it wasn't an issue emotionally or anything like that.
Yeah. So, and then you started your journey on Newsnight with Paxman. At that point in time, any imposter syndrome, any what the hell am I getting myself into? I think I may know the answer, but...
Yes, I'm afraid you've stumbled into one of my topics that I imposter syndrome isn't a thing to me.
Yeah.
So the challenge, I think, with the creation of this idea of imposter syndrome, and I know some people find comfort in it, and it's an explanation for them, so I don't want to be pejorative towards that. Yeah. But I think it's just a new layer of making those of us who are outsiders or not cut from the same cloth feel different yet again, and giving a name to it.
Yeah.
So I really reject it for that reason, because when people would say to me, oh, have you got imposter syndrome? I'd be like, no, you're the one that should have an imposter syndrome, because I've worked my nads off.
Yeah.
So I felt it was an extra layer to make those of us who didn't come through the normal channels feel even less part of the club.
Interesting.
So I'm afraid I am not a great fan of the idea of imposter syndrome.
No. And
Sorry, you stumbled into that.
No. Don't apologise at all. It's actually quite helpful to hear a different perspective on it.
I've just never heard a man say it as well, and that always is a test for me. If I've never heard a man say it, that's usually a bad sign.
Never heard a man say...
I've got imposter syndrome.
Okay. I have imposter syndrome all the time.
Well, this is my first one.
But that's a really interesting take on it. And I think it's a really kind of nice reflection of the self-belief that you carry as well. because, you know, as we talked about at the start, that is, I think it's a gift, and
it's a huge gift. I know how lucky I am to have it,
and it's really nice to hear a different take on it. But in terms of so I remember watching Paxman growing up. I did, for whatever odd reason, undergrad, I did politics as a degree, just because that's what I was interested in at the time. Don't have an interest anymore, but that's what I was interested in at the time.
I can understand.
Yeah. So I used to love watching him. I used to love how sharp he was. I used to love how direct he was. I used to love how fearless he came across. I would certainly be fearful if I was working with him. How was it working with him, and did you find it challenging? And if you did, how did you move through it?
Of course. I mean, you know, the man is a genius. I mean, he's still with us, thankfully. It's just that when you start doing production, bear in mind, I'd never done television. I'd never done news. I'd never done daily news. I was so out of my depth. It was absolutely hilarious. You know, I remember the first day I turned up, I thought it would be photocopying. And they're like, you're doing a disco. I'm like, what's a disco? Discussion.
Right.
It's the lead discussion. This is on Bleeding Newsnight. And it's about the Irish economy. I mean, to tell you that my knowledge of economics and Ireland combined would be basically the back of a small stamp was an understatement.
Right.
So, and by the way, you'll be briefing Jeremy Paxman at 8 p.m. I'm just like, you have to be joking me. And the thing about Jeremy is very similarly to Andrew Dilnot, but, you know, in a slightly more fearsome way. He never suffered fools gladly. Why should he? He was the best of the best.
Yeah.
And in terms of his capabilities, and that's what I particularly loved about him, as a producer, you learn quickly there are two types of presenter. Don't ask me to tell you the latter ones. The first type is they're an encyclopedia, just like a barrister is. You know, a barrister largely is 95% their own knowledge and then 5% pure graft. Now, with a presenter like Jeremy, it's 95% is probably being unfair. It's probably 99%. And 1% is the graft of the production, just bringing him the information he needs to bring his brilliance to the fore.
Yeah.
That's very unusual.
Yeah.
A lot of presenters are 95% the graft of the producer, 5% their own graft. So it was the greatest privilege to work with him.
Right.
Because, you know, he had you on your toes. You think you'd done a great job. You were giving him questions, which he would then say on Newsnight, which I found mind-blowingly exciting.
Yeah.
And if you missed one thing in your brief, where you have to do like 3 pages pretending you were a global expert in something you knew nothing about 6 hours ago, that really spoke to my intellectual kind of like, you know, enjoyment of peril. But he would always notice the one thing that you thought he wouldn't notice. And then you'd have 5 minutes before we're live on air to go and find that thing whilst in dire panic. And it was just really great and terrifying, of course.
Yes.
But it was just a real reminder of how brilliant he was. And, you know, Newsnight was the pinnacle in terms of the experience that I had at that time working with him. It was beyond my wildest dreams.
Yeah,
It really was.
sure. Yeah. What do you think was the main takeaway you took from that period of time in terms of, you know, what you may have learned in terms of skill set yourself or otherwise?
Well, when I first arrived, there was a deputy editor there who's become a somewhat contentious figure, Robbie Gibb, now known as Sir Robbie Gibb. And I remember he gave me really great advice. So thank you, Robbie, for the unlikely event you're listening. Really great advice he gave me was, first of all, don't pretend you're something you're not.
Right.
Because people will sniff it here. And the best advice he gave me was, never pretend that you know something that you don't, because everyone here will know. And so I used to sit in these editorial meetings where basically I had to write down phonetically all these names and acronyms they were using. And it's a bit of a kind of, you know, get your kind of like best anecdote out, show how clever you are. It reminded me a bit like being at university, really. Those kind of seminars where everyone would try and show off. But they're brilliant people. You know, I'm not criticizing it. But I would have to write down phonetically names and things. And then I'd be told to go and get an interview with X. I've got no clue who that is. And then go and find the information or ask someone. So I exposed myself to a lot less risk through Robbie's advice.
Right.
Which was to make sure that I never pretended I knew something I didn't.
Yeah.
And that was, I think, the most important part of working at Newsnight. Because it's hard, because there are so many intellectually gifted people who know seemingly everything about everything. And I knew that I was very intellectually gifted, but my background meant I'd grown up in a house of Jilly Cooper and the Daily Mail, not Encyclopedia Britannica and Catullus and Wagner. So I didn't have a lot of the cultural background and just knowledge that they took for granted. I never understood the joke about Sophocles that they kept making. I didn't really get lots of the cultural references they had.
Yeah.
So I was starting, in a sense, from scratch. But I like a challenge. And I didn't, to my knowledge, ever get litigated against at Newsnight, which is great. And I learned so much because I was happy to say when I knew nothing, which was surprisingly often.
Yeah. And it sounds like, I mean, that feels to me like they're great life lessons, aren't they? Those things. Like I learned through, through my recovery and when I got sober, just the general concept of, people aren't fools. And if you think, I used to portray an image to people that was one of, okay, I'm successful or I'm good at doing this, that or the other. But obviously actions speak far louder than words. So you can say as much as you want, and people can see through it. And in turn, by acting, that creates better trust with people and better relationships. So I wonder if that actually played out a lot, because one of your skill sets seems to be building relationships, which you did a lot of on Newsnight, which then ultimately led you to the interview, which you're obviously now doing lots of work around off the back of the Netflix documentary. And do you think that a lot of that played out in terms of the way you approach life on a wider scale looking back now? Or
yeah, absolutely. I mean, I know you've been through some very tough times, and I think it's just a matter of being able to take the humility, the word that you used earlier, to just put your hands up and say, I had a tough time, or I behaved badly. We've both done it, I'm sure. And I think that in a sense that humanity builds relationships. It used to be the case, and it still is sometimes. Post-COVID, I think it's a bit better that those kinds of soft skills, as people call them, I disagree again. They are the hardest skills of all. People find them very hard.
Yes, yeah.
Connecting, revealing stuff about themselves, being compassionate, patient, revealing insecurities, showing flaws. That stuff is really hard as hell.
Really hard,
you know that, right?
Yeah.
It's much easier to pretend you're, kind of this perfect person
100%.
who's super clever and super brilliant and nothing bothers. No one's like that.
No.
So in a sense, it was my honesty, or lack of guile, as my mum would say. I don't know how to live any differently. So it's not a skill set. It's just a fact.
Right.
But that lack of guile, I really noticed the massive difference in my life and lots of the people I work with. All brilliant people, but you could just feel the front. And it must be exhausting.
Yeah.
That front must be exhausting.
Yes, yeah.
And I've never experienced that exhaustion.
Yeah.
Ever, not once in my entire life.
Yeah. It's really interesting. What's your relationship like with fear? Do you ever feel fearful of anything?
It's really interesting. I think I've felt fear twice in my life. Leaving aside anything to do with a child, because you just live in constant fear, right? Parenting's just a state of constant fear. But I had a period where I couldn't get on a plane. I had an experience that I won't bore you with, and I felt this pure, overwhelming fear about flying that I've luckily managed to work on. It's taken me a while. And the only other time I ever felt real fear was the day after the Prince Andrew interview.
Interesting.
And it was just this overwhelming influx of interest and phone calls and jokes that friends meant funnily, but about, you're going to end up 6 feet under, or you better look out for cars. And they meant it funnily. But that day after that interview, I remember I didn't go out the whole day. There was somebody said there was some paparazzi outside. Whether there were, I don't know, because I didn't open the curtains. And I just lie there and I was like, what is this feeling? And I thought, gosh, I am so exposed here. I'm a single parent on a single income that wasn't huge, bringing up a child on my own at a known address, with a visible kind of look that's very easy to find. If people take against on this, I'm in serious trouble. And if something goes wrong for the BBC, I could lose my job, and I could be in the papers having lost my job. So I felt fear that day, and it wasn't a nice feeling.
And what happened? Did you just wake up the next day and it had gone, or?
It hadn't gone, but I just had to get on with it because I had a kid to feed and a job to do. So, you get up and you carry on, and it dissipated. But it was definitely an unusual feeling and an unnerving one, because everything I've done since then relies on a certain fearlessness or foolhardiness,
Yes.
or just the self-belief again. Because, I'd never written a book, and I wrote one in 3 months, 80,000 words.
Yeah.
I'd never done a different job, for a number of years, and now I've done about 6 different ones. So it's just the whole thing was really kind of crystallized in that one day. It was a Sunday.
Yes.
The interview went out on Saturday, and I didn't leave the house, and I didn't even turn the lights on. So I remember that day, and that day was important because it reminded me I didn't want to feel that again. And it also was a bit of a kick up the bum, Is this what you want to do with your life? What do you want to do moving forward?
Yeah.
And obviously I've been incredibly fortunate since that day, but it could have been very different.
Yes. Yeah. No risk, no reward. Do you think you've ever failed at anything?
I don't really see failure as a thing.
Yeah.
Perhaps that's helpful. I mean, certainly when I left the bar, people were very keen to give me the impression I'd failed. Back to our objective, subjective.
Yeah.
Oh, how could you give up a job like that? Oh, what a fool, I didn't see it that way because I was happy. So success to me is being happy, and I've done everything I can along the way. Other people might say, well, you could have been the editor of Newsnight. You could have been running a major company. You could have been doing this. Perhaps I could. I believe I could have done any of those things, but I don't see it as a failure because I am the happiest person I know, and my kid is great and healthy and wonderful, and I have lovely friends who I get to see, and I have a life that I'm really grateful for. So I don't see any of it as failure, and I've had a million opportunities. Then I just think that's hugely lucky as well.
Yeah, no, for sure. And with a lot of that, that is I think a mindset thing, and that is, you can either see it as an opportunity, and if something's fallen in a way that you don't like, as you alluded to earlier, you're not guaranteed anything in life, so you can move on, or you can dwell on it as, ironically, the way my brain works is I will dwell on it and I will go, you failed, you're a failure, but that's just how my brain is wired. And but everything's a learning opportunity is the way I see it. And
you're right.
Quite right, happiness is the end goal. So actually, if you're focusing on that and you're aware of it, then your quid's in, as they say. What do you think is one of the things that people misunderstand about you the most?
I think I remember there was a phrase George W. Bush used where he was like taking the piss out of because he said he was misunderestimated. Right. And I think it's a fantastic word that he accidentally made up that day. I think sometimes people misunderestimate me, and, it doesn't usually work out well for them. But also being misunderestimated has been hugely helpful to me, because the assumption that because you look a certain way or come from a certain background, or, I modeled very briefly, then you're blonde and you wear lip gloss, that you're not the brightest, all those kinds of assumptions. I'm like Teflon, they just kind of fall off of me. But I suspect that, as one of my colleagues once said, who shall remain nameless, but again, I took it with great grace, and I laughed. I thought it was a lovely thing to say. He said, you look very daffy on the outside sometimes, but you're a killer, Sam. And I took that as a massive compliment. I'd put it on a t-shirt if I'd be bothered.
I love it. Two kind of final closing questions. One, which I always like to ask, is not a unique one, but I think it's quite a nice one. What, if any, advice would you give your younger self?
None. I think advice is overrated, and I've always been loath to listen to advice, and I know lots of people who really like other people's opinions to form their life, and very early on I decided that I would choose my way and take the consequences. So that was the advice I gave myself at 18, and I've stuck with it ever since.
Side question off the back of that. Have you ever had any mentor figures in your life then?
My mum, I would say, with all that unconditional love. I would say mentoring, I try to do a lot of it myself.
Yeah.
Because I think, forgive me, sounds a bit arrogant, but I have the group of things that make me a mentor, because I'm compassionate, I listen, I genuinely want to help people. Yeah. And I don't take it personally when they usually vault over me and then become more successful than me. But I've never really trusted my career or my decisions with other people. Yeah. So the only advice or mentoring I would take would be my mother's love, and that's good enough for me. Yeah.
Okay. So final question, which off the back of that might be tricky to answer. If you were in a room full of 100 strangers and you had to give one piece of advice, what would it be?
That they want to receive advice from me?
Yeah.
Interesting. My advice would be, don't look for my advice. Just trust your gut It's your life. Live with the consequences. Good luck. I'm sure you'll do great. And if you don't, dust yourself off and just try again.